How are you guys?
Literally like wolfing pizza to get ready for this. Oh, look at your office! You have such a nice office. You look like you're in a green room.
This is my house too. This is right off of my bedroom.
I couldn't hear your voice, Diane.
No voice.
Okay.
No voice. Sometimes if you reboot your computer, like is it a PC? It's a Mac. I couldn't hear you. I could just read your lips, just so you know.
Your microphone is not red, right?
Right.
So the microphone button is not red.
Right. Like you're part of this, and we see you, but it's just not miking. I mean, I can try messing around with it. I have some settings here. Like, I can turn your microphone off and back on.
Okay. Nice visuals. Well done. She's good at that.
All right.
So how many people are in your seminar?
It's just like 12 or 13 students. And yeah, I mean, it's really fun to organize it around. Try it now, Diane.
How is it?
Yay.
All right, here we go.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, let me get back out of this control room thing. All right, this is the important part, I think, for, I don't know if you guys have these functions, but like...
Yeah. Yes.
So the unfortunate thing is we can't put them on each other. We can only put them on themselves, on ourselves. Yes, the Dr. Seuss hat.
I think that's pretty much me.
So how are you guys doing?
Good.
Welcome, welcome. We're going to theory chat for a little bit.
Awesome.
And like I said the other night, I think a way to get started, I'll just throw at both of you all a kind of general question about what you see as the importance of Deleuze and Guattari or Deleuze's work for rhetorical studies in general and for your work in particular. So I'll throw that out to you, Nate, first, and we'll go from there.
So importance of D&G for rhetoric, and then from my work.
Or anything vaguely related to those issues.
Vaguely related? Yeah, I think they're really essential. People to be read for people doing work in anything related to process philosophy, posthumanism, the place we are now. In a lot of ways, I think they're really important. Even if you don't get their weirdness or want to have it on you, I think it's really important to just be somewhat familiar with them. I find them endlessly useful, but not on their own terms.
What do you mean?
Well, I like a lot of their concepts, but I always want to modify them. I want to do something else with them. So you had asked in an email before about the inexactness and sort of a non-transferable relation, and that's the only relation I have with them is non-transferable. I can't do them the way that they want to do what they're doing.
I think they want you to do that.
Go ahead, yeah, please.
I think they want you to use them that way. I don't think they want to be used in the way that they use themselves. I agree that they're useful only by utilizing them in theory that works for you, that works for your present moment and where you are in that process. So you can be playful with them.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't say, well, I think I mentioned that people who use Burke in a very systematic way, and occasionally you find somebody who tries to do that with Deleuze and Guattari or Deleuze, and it is so painful. I don't enjoy it at all. It's a slog just to get comfortable with the vernacular and then to use it in a way that and they said so much about what they were concerned about. I don't feel like there's much left on the table about capitalism from their point of view. I could be wrong about that, but it seems like there's not a lot of space left for that. So yeah, I just want to do other stuff with them when I use them. So I take a little concept and I try and tweak it back into what I'm concerned with.
Yeah, I mean, I find, you know, just in terms of the stuff that we were talking about via email exchange, and I describe, so in reading the first 60 pages of What is Philosophy, I feel like I leave that and I feel like I sort of get what they're doing, but I don't understand it, and I don't think I can explain it very well. And for me, that's a kind of unique relationship where I feel like I get it, but I don't understand it. And I'm also, importantly, I feel like not terribly drawn to understand it. You know, like I don't feel as if, okay, I really do have to parse out what they mean by intuition or communication. I mean, that work can be done, and I want to do it. I'm in part drawn to it, but I also feel like, you know, do I actually have to understand how the components of a concept, what they are, and how they work together in order to get a sense of what they're trying to do with the kind of material immateriality of a concept there? And I don't think I do. Like, I don't think it's necessary. So.
Right. Well, I had a question about this related to your work and Brian's, Diane, about the semiotic core in genotext. Would you say, so this is like appropriation, right? Taking a plane of immanence, which is, I think, is an incredibly useful and important concept, but again, not quite what they are doing with it. Like, I get why they want it and they need it. I don't want that. I'm not trying to explain where philosophers, you know, the ground in which, or the soil in which their concepts are allowed to grow. I don't care, as a rhetorician. So would you say, what would you say, Diane, are similarities between the semiotic core or genotext from Kristeva versus a plane of immanence to concepts? Because those are not the same, but they are really resonant concepts. There's like this subterranean requisite existence, a cora of sorts, not necessarily a cora, but it's got to be there.
Right.
And every theory of invention has one of these things, whatever they would call it, or if they have a name for it at all. It's there. So how would you say that Kristeva versus Deleuze and Guattari? Are there any sense of similarities there?
Yeah, I see them both as the foundation of generation or process that is needed in, I think, any theory at least that will be dealing with some sort of materiality or physical presence in some way. And we are, you know, we made up the phrase choric connection in that piece. And that was, and so it's different. It's different from the way that perhaps Kristeva wanted to use it, but it's useful for us to get at this sense of how if you share rhythms, and so we're trying to draw on the how some aspects of the way we move through space are shared with people, and that you can have connections based on those habits or practices that then become the I don't know if it's foundation, but allow you then to articulate symbolically, or but I don't necessarily, I'm not comfortable separating the semiotic cora from the symbolic. I think those always have to work together, and that they are they depend on each other.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's the one of the things that I like in terms of this What is Philosophy is that this is on 23, like concepts are what he describes them as centers of vibrations, in terms of the rhythmic language you were just using there. So the one talks about resonance instead of correspondence. And that issue of rethinking a terminology of relationality around something like resonance rather than mimetic or representational relationships is, I think, one of the really interesting targets of lots of contemporary work. You know, but Deleuze and Guattari are obvious symptoms of it.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think it's really going back to the reason for writing. That alone, even if you don't necessarily pick up their toolkit as they seem to want to use it, but want to do something else with it, I think they're great inroads. I mean, when I read them, they really help me come to terms with problems I want to discuss, but not quite the way they do. And I'm like, oh yeah, I was trying to think that same problem. You were there first on a different topic, but it's similar to what I want to try and say now. And I find that very, very useful. So the way they talk about the plane of immanence to me is a really great way of dealing with I mean, it gets away from them at the end of that chapter. I think it starts. They have to start to build it out into kind of a framework, and it gets a little bit loose at that point. But the notion that the unthought quality of thought that allows thought to happen, or the image of thought, even though it's not a specific thought, it's that image of, maybe very like an image of thinking, like the activity of thinking that you imagine creates possibilities for actual concepts to come into being, and you have to have one of those. You can't not have one of those. That is really useful. So that sort of envelope that is going to be there no matter what, you will institute it when you try and think, to me is wonderful. But I think rhetoricians find that very challenging because we want to make that reducible to a product that someone designed ultimately. And the whole point is it's not designable. It's pre-design, after design, post-design. It's just there. You can't actually make one of these things. If you set out to do it, you'd be doing it wrong. And I think that's, for me, one of the challenges for teaching rhetoric, which is so intentional, but recognizing the lack of intention with something like a plane of immanence or a genotext as well. How do I talk about that and bring it into a classroom is kind of challenging.
Absolutely. And I find that, at least for rhetorical criticism, a lot of textbooks that try and teach rhetorical criticism struggle with this as well in terms of whatever the concept that's going to be pitched. So with text or object of study, those are already leading you into a particular way of dealing with whatever rhetorical event you might be studying. And even by saying rhetorical event, I feel like it's already leading you into a particular way to view what's happening. So I appreciate that they connect their concept to problem, that you have to, in some ways, you can't separate the concept from the problem, and beginning to think about what are the problems that I'm dealing with and what are concepts that can be linked to those that will be useful for me. So maybe getting into those kinds of classes through problems rather than the cookie cutter concepts that are handed to you might be a pedagogical.
I'd be interested in your guys' response to this because from the beginning, and maybe it's because I have a kind of allergy to the phenomenological tradition, but the terminology of problems as a constituent, very funny, the terminology of problems that, for instance, clearly you see here, but you also get in Foucault, as distinct from the terminology of questions. Right, so I mean, questions are for Heidegger and for Derrida and for others. The questioning seems to be the driving element, whereas here the terminology of problems in a more materialist framework. Now, of course, we're talking about problems in terms of not a math problem, right? But it makes total sense, and this is one of the things that appeals to me is that you can talk about like a plant attempting to grow as a problem, right? This is a problem. The plant faces a problem. How do I require resources? And that problematics can move across different venues in ways that questions seem not able to. And I've always liked that. I've always liked concepts make no sense without problems. Problems aren't really human things.
Yeah. I agree completely. That's why I like the concept of problem, and I really enjoy your book on invention. I'd really like to hear you talk more about invention in light of a plane of immanence. I mean, it's clearly an inventional problem, but the way of thinking about just the canonical issues in rhetoric, for me, it's always been those are problems. We think of them as skill sets. They are problems. How do you create? How do you remember? How do you order? How do you enact? Those things those abilities have to be recreated again and again and again. They don't just exist for you to grab them when you need them. And so that's like the plant, getting the nourishment it needs to grow. Those are problems. And so that kind of thinking, I think, is really fruitful if you just say, wait a minute, you can't actually assume what you think is given about any sort of rhetoric. You can't do that. It's at the most basic level. Even the stuff the unthought that allows you to think itself is changing as you think in response to your thinking. That is disturbing. For people who want to focus on how do I actually make this group of people not kill each other or vote a certain way or be more effective in their writing or just learn to self-create a little bit more freely than they did yesterday. All those possibilities that make rhetoric fun to teach are also very difficult. We say, but wait a minute, everything I just said is so contingent, you can't even imagine how contingent it is. It's contingent beyond your imagination. It's disturbing. But a problem is a nice way to sort of raise it. The problem of your contingency is what you're facing, not the problem of the specific moment.
When that contingency goes all the way down, it's not just a historical or a cultural moment. It has to do with the contours of thinking. Like to me, the image of thought terminology, as it refers back to difference and repetition, is one of the places where I can understand this plane of eminence a little bit better and get a sense of what they're talking about. Where, like, the image of thought that's predominant is this image in which thought orients towards the true. Right, and that's that's a simple sentence, but then you go, oh yeah, why do we think that thought orients? Why do we think that thought wants truth? And so this sort of revelation of this, and it's not even an assumption. It's because there's no logical position that you would call it an assumption. It is the image of thought within which we think. Right. And that to think is to reinvent that image simultaneously. It all becomes like nightmarishly chaotic, which is an important word here. So
right, yeah, absolutely, I agree. And so that sense in which, I mean, that is not, and they put it not, I wouldn't say well, but effectively. I mean, I get it. Is when you start to say that something is imminent to, you actually invert it and make imminence the product as opposed to the condition. And that's exactly right. And I think that's probably one of the challenges for teaching it rhetorically is you want to turn everything into the outcome of rhetoric. Mm-hmm. Rhetoric produces everything, but it cannot be produced. But of course it is. So there has to be, I mean, for me, but if I was to teach this to students, which I very well may be doing next fall, I would be trying to talk about the way in which the rhetoricity that you are now enacting is recreating its own conditions without your design, without your intent, but it's necessarily happening. So not everything is a product, and yet it is created. And that's a distinction that's very difficult to maintain. I think just as humans, I mean, as animals, the kind of animals that we are, that's really difficult to sort of deal with.
Well, what about the things that are getting distinguished in here? I mean, so obviously he wants to say that marketing is not, that's a big target, and I think that there is a historical element to the new philosophers in France that's relevant on this one. But let's bracket that for a second. Marketing is an issue for him. Importantly enough for our fields of study, communication, right? Communication is an issue. There seems to be some kind of disconnect between something like states of affairs, right? Not disconnect's not the right word, but a problematic relationship between states of affairs and concepts in the plane of immanence. And I mean, what implications does that have for the very questions that you're putting, which is people who want to know how to do a rhetorical criticism, that's asking a very particular type of question. And there's part of me and the sort of proprietary relationship that philosophy has with the concept here that feels like he just wants to say that other stuff just isn't philosophy. Right, and philosophy really is only this stuff,
Which I'm not sure why is that important? That was something that I kept thinking about as I was reading it. Why is this disciplinary distinction so important to him? Why is he so protective of saying that the concept is only of philosophy? Particularly, I think we feel that distinctly in rhetoric because the tradition has for so long been linked to philosophy, which comes first, chicken or egg kind of, philosophy or rhetoric, and that we aren't housed in a philosophy department. We're housed either in communication or rhetoric and composition, English. So I don't necessarily agree, and I would need to look at it more carefully, but I don't necessarily agree with the way he even constitutes communication. I feel a sense of a transmission model a little bit in terms of how he's using it rather than a constitutive approach. So those are just some of my initial thoughts. What do you think, Nate?
Well, I just look back to the discussion of both what you and Brian do with genotext in Lost in Translation and what you, John, do with Invention in your book, is that the question of creativity and creating does not belong to philosophy. They can't have it. No one can have it. The creativity to me is something that is if there's a plane of immanence that is the plane of immanence of which all the other planes are interleaved through, it's creativity. That there is the extant fact that new things happen, and you can't, and none of us has an answer to why that is. You can invoke a god, you can invoke a chemical composition, doesn't matter. It's all speculative in the most silly ways. Shit gets made, and it just keeps getting made, and nobody knows why. So that's your plane of immanence, and everything comes from that. So that to me is really what's fun about it, is that there's an unexplainable excess, and we're in it. And so nothing gets to go outside of that to have the perspective on the rest of it. That's just a little clique that thinks it's in the really cool space, talking about everybody else. Nobody gets to have that space. So
I'm going to be a contrarian on this one.
Say what?
I'm going to be a contrarian on this one.
Go for it.
For reasons that relate to Diane's great point about, like, what does it mean for the process philosophers to write a book called What is Philosophy? Like, what is? And then the chapters, what is a concept? What is the plane of immanence? I mean, these are the guys who, I have it here, the end of the first chapter of 1,000 Plateaus, where they've done the tree and the rhizome stuff. Well, the tree imposes the verb to be, but the fabric of the rhizome is the conjunction and. This conjunction carries enough force to shake and uproot the verb to be. Where are you going? Where are you coming from? Where are you heading? These are totally useless questions.
Right.
I mean, so these are the guys who, like, you would think, I mean, this is the book right before, right, that you'd say the question, what is philosophy, would be exactly not the question that they would ever want to ask, right? But another way of asking it is, or another way of being, well, I'll just lead with that and not get into the, because I actually think that I agree with them that philosophy is in fact the proper domain of the concept. But we're not talking about disciplinary distinction of philosophy. We are talking about the relationship of friend and claimant, and which is why they start with that.
Yes, and that was my question. My big question about this: if we were to, again, the anexact relationship. I love that you framed that in the email. The anexact was perfect. What am I going to do with this that is an anexact relationship to this book? And as a rhetoric person coming into this, my question is: okay, well, what is rhetoric? If the concept is not the object of rhetoric, big picture rhetoric, whatever rhetoricity might be, disciplinary or not, which I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I don't actually think generating concepts is the point of rhetoric. It happens because you have to. What would it be? I mean, that's a question I can't really give a good answer to. And the problem I see it is one of connectivity, address, turning to, influence, responsiveness, but I can't really put a word on it that would say, oh, it's the concept. In that way, it would really hold for me.
When I read, I tend to think of rhetoric embedded in this plane of immanence, to steal from John's work in saying that rhetoric is about change. Change is embedded in that sense of Cora, embedded in that sense of the plane of immanence. And so that you can't separate, I think, the concept from that plane. So rhetorically speaking, I struggle with the definition of philosophy that that it is the art of invention without thinking about the emergence of that invention rhetorically.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I'd want to distinguish the disciplinary question from, because to me, one of the implications of this is that there's lots of people doing philosophy in lots of different departments, that not under the name of philosophy. And what distinguishes the philosopher is a kind of relationship towards the concept, and that it's a relationship that is one of generativity, production, novelty. And I mean, I think of Nate, when you ask the question, what is rhetoric? I mean, I've had clever answers in print, which is like, what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the art of never finally answering that question, which includes every attempt to answer that question, because they don't actually finally answer that question either. So go ahead and answer it. But I mean, a much simpler definition is, like, I actually hang on to the persuasion notion, and to me it's turning. I mean, persuasion in the ancient sort of precognitive sense that Michael Nas talks about it's turning. I mean, so rhetoric is the art of responsive turning, and like across any kind of registers, not beginning with the human. For me, like I have this I think the paradigmatic image of rhetoric should be heliotropism instead of what we think of, which is like a presidential address. That's the image of rhetoric that we all exist within our head when we begin to talk about the rhetorical, as opposed to a plant turning towards the sun, But
I have to agree. I think I've always thought about it in similar terms. I like aggressivity as a contemporary concept for trying to grab that, is that things are addressed not in the sense of being styled, although they could have some particular style to them, but the sense of being oriented towards and leaning towards this or leaning towards that. But also, and this is where I really like Diane Davis's work, is the compulsion within that. That the responsiveness is not something you can really turn off.
Oh, yeah.
At some level, you just can't. You can't be an open, vulnerable creature and just say, well, I won't respond to the world. Well, guess what? You just died. It's not happening. So the sense in which there's a compulsion to respond, and it involves this turning, and then at different levels of sophistication, doing something with that to do, and this is where I really like, there's a weird resonance between Kristeva and Suzanne Langer. It's weird. Suzanne Langer, in her book Philosophy and New Key, talks about the way in which the brain, she's trying to do cognitive stuff, or very early cognitive stuff, but the brain generates a lot more than goes in, and it converts into an excess. And so for her, symbolism is like the throw-off of sparks dragging, like a car dragging something down the road, and there's just sparks flying all the time. More comes out. And to me, that's what's interesting about rhetoric, is it's not an input-output model. There are things that are happening, and extra goes on. And that's the part that really interests me. The more it gets close to like almost a survivalist, I need this resource to do this thing so that I can survive, that is not rhetorical. Rhetoric is always way in excess of anything you could possibly need, which is why it's great. It does absolutely more than you could ever want, and at the same time, and this is R.L. Scott's line, absolutely less than you need it to do, always. It is never what you want, and it's always more than what you want, and you can't get out of that mess. And that's what makes it really cool, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I like that sense, that ecological sense of rhetoric. And this is linked back to what you were saying, John, about how you identify rhetoric with troping. Because I find, linking this back to Deleuze and Guattari, that the trope embodies both difference and repetition. Tropes both thematize, they are the repetition through fashion, manner, but then they also demonstrate difference through their turning, their perspective, their change of perspective, their way. So the common definition embodies both that difference and repetition. And this is one of the things that I actually one of the lines I don't like about the Lost in Translation piece is that we stated that that tropes are similar to symbols rather than the semiotic hora. And I don't think that you can disarticulate the two. I think that tropes are ecological. And I'm working on that piece with the marine biologist, and we're talking about this funky concept, endosymbiosis, where you have an organism living within another organism, and they have a mutual relationship, and they're evolving together, and eventually over time, the organelle or organism within it becomes a part of it, and so you have this part-to-whole relationship of where it eventually becomes a part of the whole. And there are so many ways in which tropes are seen in the material world. They are types of movements, and so I really love that sense of rhetoric as tropic.
Yeah, I mean, two quick things. First, this is an aside, but Diane, we definitely got to talk, because the first version of my dissertation was on symbiogenesis. So I wrote up a proposal of when symbiosis became a verb, but only temporarily. It's now, interestingly enough, we won't have this conversation right now, but I'm very interested in symbiosis as a component of evolutionary transformation as well. So we can talk about that another time.
Yeah.
But what seems to, interestingly to me, what's coming up in each of these conversations that I've been doing with various folks on totally different topics is the problem of the terminology that you're using here is the relation between the semiotic and the symbolic. we've talked about it in previous weeks as a relationship between signifying and asignifying, which that's the terminology that I tend to use. You could talk about it in terms of representation and affect. So there's this. So the recurring issue seems to be we want to be good monists. Right? We don't want to say there's this kind of thing and there's that kind of thing. I mean, so we want to say there's this kind of fundamental sameness of stuff, and at the same time, we want to hang on to to the value of traditional distinctions. So the question is, how do you hang on to the value of traditional distinctions and not simply reproduce them? Well, you lay out a plane of immanence, right? You establish a plane of immanence, and I mean, it's just interesting to me that that's been a recurring trend in the conversations I've been having.
Right.
Yeah. I think Karen Barad's. I was just going to say, I think Karen Barad's work has been useful in that sense to think about diffraction and entanglements. We just have to stop. Eventually, I think that critique will get over it, and then we'll stop bifurcating that and start to.
Well, it's almost like we don't really know how to be I mean.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's the hardest thing in the world. It's the hardest thing in the world. You have to. Yeah. I think it's incredibly difficult. Even when you're trying not to institute those divisions that give you some external perspective on the thing you're talking about, you find you have to do it again and again, and it's very, very weird. So
this is what I find.
One thing, Diane, on the biology thing, I am so excited that you're doing that. I have thought that for a long time, and that you, John, I didn't know you had any background in that or interest in that. I know a number of biologists, molecular biologists. I've got friends in all high places, right? But no, and I've often found that biology is so weirdly similar to rhetoric in terms of its intense interest in these weird, convoluted turns on top of turns, and that actually is what life is this weird set of involutions. And if you can understand those moves, you understand a lot about biology. It has so much similarity to rhetoric. I mean, it's probably not a strange phenomenon that Aristotle's dad was a physician, right? I mean, there's a lot of John Locke was a physician. There's a lot of biology that creeps into rhetoric unexpectedly. Anyway, that's a little side comment.
Yeah. Well, no, and I've been learning more about that in working with her name's Jenny, and she's an oceanographer that studies plankton. That because marine biology and ecology is such a new field of science or study, and they're dealing with variables that they can't control. There's a lot more chaos that they have to account for. Mm-hmm. And so they don't have this scientific dogma issue that perhaps older disciplines have, or perhaps that we attribute to those kinds of sciences. And I think that's one of the benefits as well of quantum mechanics that's happening now in physics. That things are getting messier, we're not able to explain some of these, the entanglement that's taking place. Mm-hmm. So that's exciting to do more interdisciplinary kind of work with scientists who recognize the messiness and are starting to come to terms with the agency of, and I don't know if this is right, but in the way that they publish, what kind of language they use in publishing. And I think that's the fun part of working with Jenny, is talking about how that also has a agential force in the way that we articulate, which is the hardest part, I think. Because language or the written word stabilizes or does a stabilizing in ways. That Platonic agency of the written word that is so uncomfortable.
This is where I return to what we started with to a certain extent, which is Deleuze and Guattari's writing as being something, like I said, that for me I feel like I sort of get, but I don't understand. And so, and I know that, interestingly enough, like, we're not really talking very much about Deleuze and Guattari's what is philosophy. We're using it as jumping off points to talk about very related. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. And that's what I said in the email that I sent to you. I don't really quite know how to talk about Deleuze, and so even conversationally, but I mean, as we commented, like, so people think that I'm sort of Deleuze boy in the field, but I've never really written about in any
You got,
extensive.
it, you got it as a tattoo. You know you do.
Yes, I do. Well, look, I will say, I mean, it's also the idiom that to me is closest to, you know, if I were going to identify with a theoretical idiom, it would certainly be Deleuze, you know, so it's not simply wrong,
Yeah.
but nevertheless, like, how does this inform my thinking? Well, I think it provides, I won't say an alternative image of thought, but it pushes on, more than giving me concepts even, it seems like it's pushing on the plane of immanence of whatever concepts, you know, topos or repetition or anything else that I happen to be working with. So, I mean, when you talk about it providing a kind of plane of immanence, it's like, well, I can't really point to that very well, you know.
Yeah, I think they provide, a lot of methodological flexibility is what I would say. And so I was thinking about it in relationship to when I read people talk or write or use Foucault. Mm-hmm. Foucault has the methodology is a little more clear if you're going to do a genealogy or
here's his concept of power, here's how it works in this place, and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it almost seems that they're not in their books, or in at least Deleuze's books, not consistent in terms of offering a methodology. It's just kind of like, here, come play with these and have fun and, you know, create. So I think that's fun, and that gets you out of the perpetual turning where you get into same arguments over and over and over again.
Yeah, and that's what I like about them. That's what I like about them, is that they allow me, they give me space to do different things. And I'm similar, I would say, John, to you in the sense that if someone was to look at me, they'd probably say I'm a Foucauldian, but I use him a lot more as a historian and certainly as a methodologist. But when I start thinking about rhetoric, I want the kinds of flexible thinking that you get in process philosophy generally, with Whitehead, for example, but also Deleuze and Guattari. That's what I think of more when I think about the dynamism of rhetoric, the sense of being immersed, completely immersed in a space and a time and a world, and responding to it incessantly. And like you're never left alone and you're always having to respond in some way. That's what rhetoric feels like to me. And since grad school, I've thought the way, like you mentioned earlier, presidential address, these sort of things, where people want to bracket off rhetoric as somehow different from these other experiences, has never felt comfortable or even remotely true to me. So the kind of the rhetoricity of being just dumped into a live experience and then swimming endlessly. I love that about rhetoric. That's what I think is so fabulous about it, is it's like a field that is like, seriously, no matter how small you get, there are more tiny concepts you can use to explain what you just did, and you can go as big as you possibly want either. It's like up and down the scale from microcosms to macrocosms of being immersed in a world and dealing with pushing and pulling and power dynamics. And I love that completely. And Deleuze and Guattari, I think, give me the kind of space to try to entertain those ideas in a little bit more rigor than I would in terms of just spitballing it.
Well, let me follow on that point, because that's exactly what I was going to ask you about, in terms of, like, what all three of us are saying is that part of the appeal of this thinking is that it provides a flexibility or a malleability or self-mutational quality. But, I mean, the question then becomes, and I'm the last, maybe I'm not the last, but I'm the second to last person who's going to bring in policing questions. But, I mean, what does it mean to be rigorous in engagement with this thinking? Are we saying that one can just do whatever the hell one wants? What is the pedagogy then? What is the deflection? And this for me becomes, it presents a demand, which is to think rigorous conceptual engagement as something other than systematicity, and we don't have a terrain for, we don't have a vocabulary for doing that. But for instance, I know exactly what you mean when you say that, Nate, because I get manuscripts, like anytime anyone's writing on Deleuze for several of the journals, like it's going to come to me to review the manuscripts, and I get what I think are really bad readings of Deleuze, and not because they're wrong, they're just not interesting. So it's like, oh, another rhizome. Oh, you know, and look, my thing that I thought was cool is a rhizome. Like, who knew? I
spot the rhizome. Yeah, those are fun.
Right. I would never have guessed it was a rhizome. I thought it was going to be a tree. You know. So, and to me, when I say I find that those engagements with Deleuze aren't rigorous, it's not because they're inaccurate or that they haven't covered enough of the material that Deleuze is reading, but it's because they're not doing anything with it. They're not doing anything other than sort of contributing to whether it's the Deleuze paradigm or the Deleuze trademark or the rhetoric trademark or the rhetorical criticism trademark.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say yes. I agree with that. I think the concept I've always been really excited about in Whitehead, which is similar to this, is the notion of a creative advance. That instead of backwardly looking, you're always just moving forward. But how to be rigorous in that creativity is really difficult, and that's where actually, there's a lot to be learned from artists who are great artists are very, very rigorous in their process. And they don't produce great art just because they woke up one day and had a really cool idea. Maybe that happens some, right? But there's a lot of process that goes into that, so that they really train their creativity. And I think Deleuze and Guattari are very, very systematic in the sense that they are rigorous in their own self-inspection as they're creative, but that allows them to be inconsistent. So this book, the What is Philosophy, after they write 1,000 Plateaus, which says, be verbs, I mean, come on, seriously. Anyone who can do that and keep a straight face and then also do something that's worthwhile is actually being pretty rigorous. They're not being careless.
Well, how so? Explain, because I think, I brought it up before and then I just sort of threw it away with something else. But like, why call this What is Philosophy?
I couldn't possibly say really, but what it feels like to me is that they open with that thing about at a certain age, right? You start to ask these questions, right? So that's sort of old guy talk. But I think I feel a little bit of that in the sense that the more I work on rhetoric, and I'm very interested in providing ways of historicizing how modes of rhetoric emerge in the world and disappear, because I think they do. I don't really know how to explain it very well, and I'm quite certain as a field we have no consistent way of saying that. But we all kind of know what happens, but we don't really know how to explain it. And so that's just a giant problem for me. And the longer I keep thinking about it, the more I come back to really, really basic questions like, why do I care? Why is that interesting to me? And if I really push it hard enough, doesn't it become something completely other than what I thought it was in the first place? And can I be honest with myself and say, oh yeah, I've gone through the looking glass, and rhetoric isn't what I thought when I started graduate school, and I'm doing something else now. And just allowing myself to have that kind of moment, I think that's where it's coming from. If I was to say that opening moment, I think sort of sets it up as, we've thought about this long enough, we're not kind of sure what we're doing, and this is our best attempt to say, hey, if you pushed me, I would say it was this. And this is what they came up with. But that could just be,
What do you think, Diane? You're the one who raised the question in our email.
What questions can be productive, I think. If you're going to be communicating through words, you have to ask yourself, okay, what am I committed to? And even if you're going, it's a stabilizing a stabilizing kind of word, but if you're going to recognize that what you're stabilizing is a process or a movement, then I think that's okay too. So what is philosophy? It could be a tongue-in-cheek kind of question that is stabilizing creation, that is stabilizing a plane of immanence. And those are, I think, this is partly why people get nervous about talking about ontology, because ontology, it's this sort of like permanent realm, right? It is. And so maybe this is, that gateway to, we can talk about it as a process, as a permanent process. So we don't have to be scared, but we do, I think, need to ask. There are questions to ask.
Yeah,
thank you.
That's where
that's great.
Like, I think of it in relation to, again, the beginning of 1,000 Plateaus, where they're talking about the use of the word I, and the end of the paragraph is, the goal is to reach the point not where one doesn't say I anymore, but where it doesn't matter if one says I anymore. And so this is where, when I think of it this way, because I remember in graduate school when I had spent some time with 1,000 Plateaus and then got to What is Philosophy, I was like, what, how, what? And so my first instinct was it must be a joke, but I actually feel like it's not a joke. It's exactly like, it's not about substituting ands and saying and all the time instead of is. It's about making the is do the work of and.
Right.
So that's the question, and you see it in other places where they talk about, it's about making language itself stutter. Not stuttering in language, but making language itself stutter. And this to me is, so what is philosophy? Oh, and by the way, we're not just going to ask that straightforward question. We're going to give you a really straightforward answer. It's the creation of concepts. And not a particularly novel or interesting answer, by the way. They're not the first, you know. And it's like, okay, but then what is a concept? You have no fucking idea. Like, it's going to be this thing that blows your mind and has all of these. I mean, to me, when I read this, it's like, it reads a great deal like an ethnography of the future that you would find in science fiction. Where, I mean, it's just a sort of, you know, an assessment or an assay of something that is sort of unimaginable but also incredibly concrete. So, like, you know, science fiction's version of a future world, and it's exhaustive, right? It's not just like a pithy paragraph or two. It's like, no, here are all of the attributes, and you have to sort of know what they are. And by the way, try to parse them out individually, and they won't make any sense. They're not going to give you the thing. So it's like, I'm answering your question, and by the way, that answer isn't going to do anything for you in the sense of an answer. It's just going to give you relay points to jump off from.
Yeah, it reminds me of, have you read Michael Pollan's In Defense of Food by any strange chance? He does a really great discussion of nutritionism as an ideology, although he doesn't refer to it as ideology, but basically the notion that you can boil down nutrition to specific elements. It's just atomism, right? You know, like X number of B complex, right? And then you're going to be healthy. And in fact, none of the research really adds up to say that you can predict better health based off of, you know, that's the argument. But it's very similar to this notion, what you were just saying, is a concept is essentially organismic. You can parse it out into little bits and pieces, but all you have then are bits and pieces. It does stuff as a metabolism, right? It works together in ways that are not really parsable. And that dynamism, for me, that's the term I keep coming back to, is a dynamism. And that, if that's something that rhetoric is really into, it's a dynamism. Things are dynamic and flexible and changing, and you're in it, and you're surfing, so to speak. And that you have to be able to get comfortable with the moves and the constant movement of what are you going to move next. And rhetoric kind of says you can actually pay attention to those things as a fluidity and not just as a series of little bits and pieces that you can add up and say X number of things, therefore I will do Y. It doesn't make sense. Rhetoric done that way is often very, very bad. Even like traditional notions of it. There's a lot of, and that's why people tend to, I think, refer to it as an art as opposed to a science. They object to being a science. It's that quality of dynamism that people have to have a sense of. And I find that really attractive about the way that they talk about philosophy, is it does feel a little bit more rhetorical in the sense of that it's a series of plastic dynamisms that you're simply working within to create. And I like that quite a bit.
You silence us with your book. Like, I'm not going to be able to say anything after that.
A footnote to that, then, and this is my favorite quote from R.L. Scott of all time. He always would talk about rhetoric as this tension of the novel and the familiar. And I think it's absolutely one of the best ways. Like, you have constant newness, but it only is possible because of the familiar.
Right.
And that's where the stabilizing is to the series of ands. You have the novel and the familiar trying to find some sort of comportment with each other, that you can't simply have the novel because every moment is the first moment, and then you have no understanding, you have no thought, really. And it can't be utterly familiar because thought also dies because everything's already been thought. So there's that weird tension of novel and familiar that creates the space, the stability, but the dynamism that allows the kind of creativity that we're familiar with. It's not purely chaotic, it's not purely redundant, and somewhere in that weird space in the middle, philosophy happens, rhetoric happens, art happens, and that's where I think those fields have shared interest, is the tension of those two.
But see, I'm really...
Map them. That's a fucking hard question, but...
Go ahead, Diane.
I was just thinking about this as we talk, and I don't want to anthropomorphize, but thinking about philosophy and rhetoric as something that might be non-human. So if we're saying rhetoric is, non-human, is philosophy also non-human? To what extent are dogs creating concepts? Or, and is that even a productive question to ask? But we've certainly gone to a place where we say that rhetoric is non-human. So is philosophy too?
It would have to be. I mean, I don't see how it could not be. I mean, if you're going to buy in for a penny, in for a pound for me, if you're going to go there, I don't see how it resists it, or it cannot be that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if what we mean by the plane of immanence is the virtual, then like who does the world think it is, right? I mean, and the sort of geology of morals from the genealogy of morals, that I think for them, there's no question. I mean, what we're doing here is a kind of archaeology. I don't want to use that word because of the Foucault implications, but it is a kind of investigation of the contours of concepts, and those things aren't human at all. They're just concepts. They're this distinctive thing. You know, they're not precepts and they're not affects, which we haven't gotten to yet. But I wouldn't see any reason why they would be the sole, domain of human. I mean, it's not reflection and it's not contemplation, right? And not communication for perhaps questionable. Disciplinary. Well, and actually, I mean, I'm a little more sympathetic towards the critique of communication and to the sort of privileging of philosophy in weird ways that I wouldn't think that I was. But like I take what he's talking about in communication. I mean, I think that there's a reference to Rorty in the notes. It's like that sort of the notion of the conversation of mankind in Burke, right? Which is just a series of dialogic interlocutors at separate points, and it's like, look, there's no creation happens there. That what's required for creation for Deleuze is a kind of indistinction among the points, which is to say, if I can situate your position relative to mine, and I see you as an interlocutor, and I'm an interlocutor, and then we have another, the prospect of creation or production of the new is just not available. What is available is I can learn your position, right? Like, or you can learn mine, or we could change positions a little bit, but that nothing's going to come. I mean, that's, to me, what they're always interested in is the zones of indiscernibility and the cultivation of zones of indiscernibility among practices and rhythms, and that's a very tricky prospect, right? It's by definition risky.
I think, however, that in communication that you are, even though you're sharing, there is still a difference. There's no guarantee of what you're sharing that it is the same. So it's still productive in the interaction you're still creating.
You can be, and I think that's where, I mean, one would have to be careful about this, because at least in terms of how I think of it, he's got this great stuff on a conversation, like what a conversation is good for and what it's worthless for, and one of the things it's clear, it's like any given conversation could work in multiple registers for different people at different moments. So to say there's a given instant where we are in the midst of a communicative paradigm, by which he means distinct nodes interacting around a position, and then they vacillate into a philosophical kind of creation of conceptual moment. So, like, to me, that's how I think of it. I just think there's no such thing as philosophy. There's just the philosophical. There's no such thing as rhetoric. There's just the rhetorical. And what we're talking about is diagnosing different, tendencies or inclinations within interactions. I mean, we all know the experience, especially in graduate school, and hopefully if we're lucky it continues, where you can't distinguish your thinking from your mentors and your friends and the books that you are reading. And it's precisely, I mean, that's usually experienced as anxiety, right? Because we don't yet know who we are, but it's precisely that sense of anxiety that I think they see as the positive and productive. Not that anxiety is positive and productive, but that zone of indiscernibility where I don't know it's me, and I don't know it's you, and I can't simply take credit for it. It's not a position that I have. I don't know what I think because I am constituted by all of these other discourses.
Right. I would say, too, if you push communication far enough, it becomes something it's not. Anything does. And so when you really think of it, all the movement and the kind of chaos that they're talking about, if communication is pure flow, which is one very easy way to define it, that's Deleuze and Guattari. They put it in a specific model of communication. When it's described that way, yeah, I have problems with that as well. It's very bidirectional. It's very limited. It's not responsive except on its own terms. Whereas if things communicate, like a communicable disease, for example, you have no control over that. It just goes. And that is more in line with their kind of thinking. You could appropriate communication in a different way that would be hospitable to them. Sure. So that's fine with me. But the sense in which, like, the way you said, like, there's only the rhetorical, I agree entirely, but I think the rhetorical is completely movable. It doesn't have any essence to it. There's nothing you can specifically say is rhetorical or is not rhetorical. It becomes so and then it's not at certain moments. Now, how we qualify or explain that, that's interesting, and it's difficult. But the rhetorical doesn't, there's not things in the world that are more rhetorical than others. And that's, I think, the conceit of humanism, is that what comes out of my mouth is more rhetorical than something else. Well, it's not if you don't speak English, right? I mean, there might be many other things happening right next to you that a human is not doing that are more significant to you than someone speaking another language yammering at you. So the sense in which the rhetorical is epiphenomenal for me is really an interesting question, and they give us those sort of an avenue to asking those kinds of questions. And I like that part of it a lot. And I want to say one last thing. When they talk about immanence, this is where I think this particular chapter on immanence gets away from them, because they want to acknowledge that immanence is not strictly about philosophers establishing, instituting, without their own willing, a kind of plane. This is on page 45, in the middle of the paragraph that carries over from 44. It is not immediately clear why immanence is so dangerous, but it is. That is a beautiful sentence. Yes, it is. I think that's perfect. It engulfs sages and gods. What singles out the philosopher is the part played by immanence or fire, echoing Heraclitus. Immanence is immanent only to itself and consequently captures everything, absorbs all one, and leaves nothing remaining to which it could be immanent. That is a really chewy, but I think really brilliant piece, but they don't actually live up to it in this chapter because they want to make immanence about a plane of immanence that philosophers produce, which would, of course, swallow them. And the point at which they get swallowed by their own concept doesn't happen in this chapter. At the end, they're diagramming, well, there's groups within planes and that kind of thing, and that's a control mode that they're imposing upon the concept they've introduced. So to me, what's really brilliant about this chapter is they introduce a concept which they can't possibly even contain, and by the end of the chapter, they're already backpedaling, which is that's awesome.
I'm going to go the exact opposite direction on you, because this is to me one of the things that I quite like about reading, and you can point it out in different chapters, is that they're frequently going to make a distinction and undo it and unravel it. So, I mean, I actually agree with what you're saying, but, you know, you continue on in that chapter, and towards the end, thought cannot stop itself from interpreting immanence as immanent to something. The great object of contemplation, the subject of reflection, or the other of communication. Transcendence is inevitably reintroduced, right? So to me, and so they spent like the 8 pages in between the moment that you quoted in that moment, sort of performing exactly like, look, here's the deal. Immanence can only be immanent to itself. But by the way, it's always tainted. It is never simply immanent to itself. It must always introduce transcendence, just like the semiotic and the symbolic, the signifying and the asignifying. So you have a staging here, to me, of precisely how a thought of pure immanence of necessity falls apart. Of necessity can't hang on to, and could never even articulate the concept of pure immanence.
Oh, that's nice. That's good. I like that.
But I'm making that up. I don't know.
No, I agree. It's like, so, yeah, no, they're aware of what's happening as they're doing. They're losing it, and they know they're losing it, and they're watching it fall away from them. But that's by design. And that's actually where I would actually say that I think that's the point that I would like to, if I could make a contribution in my career, it would to help the field of rhetoric become comfortable with that it's always losing itself, and that's what we do. Rhetoric disappears in front of us and becomes something else. It always has. It's not a bad thing. And the anxiety around the fact that whatever it is we think we're studying, it's going to mutate into something unrecognizable, probably sooner rather than later, and that's what's awesome about it. That's the best part. And there's a sense of wanting to hold it dear that I find very disturbing. You need it to teach a course when you've got undergraduates showing up and you have to pretend like you got it under control. So there's the transcendence that shoves itself right down your immanence. But it's, you know, but I really, really love the fact that rhetoric cannot stop itself. I love that part of it. So anyway, Diane, you were going to say something.
No, I don't know. I
shut it down again. Good.
But I mean, I think the point, at least for me, with Deleuze and Guattari, is not simply to revel in the things fall apart, and I don't think that's what you're saying, right? But it's not like that. There's a practice, there is a constructivism, there is a rigor of thinking involved in cultivating relations with. For me, I think of it I have a totally small practical understanding of these relations of becoming, and it has to do with like, what do I do when I read a book and when I write about it? It's that practical. It's like, who are these people that I'm engaging? What are these words that I'm engaging? And how do I cultivate relationships to them in ways that are productive and compelling, and produce, coming out of it, something unanticipated. I love, for instance, the discussion, it's the oft-quoted stuff about, and forget the problematic elements of this, the buggery, like Deleuze's buggery, his relationship to the history of philosophy, where the way that he survived his apprenticeship in the history of philosophy was to imagine it as an intellectual buggery, such that he was approaching a thinker like Kant. I mean, his books on Kant, Spinoza, approaching a thinker from behind in an attempt to give birth to a monstrous offspring that was neither his nor theirs, right? So, I mean, the whole question of buggery and offspring and whatever. But then, of course, for him, it gets interesting, and I think this is the lesson of that point is not just about buggery, but about when he got to Nietzsche, he could never tell who was buggering who. So it again, and I tend to focus on these moments of indiscernibility in the process of, and you can see how, at least for me, I can see how like trying to make something into a more smart version of itself, what you perceive as that, quickly can become like, well, wait, wasn't it already out there in front of me to begin with, and am I just catching up to? I found that when I read like Aristotle on Aristotle's physics, and a lot of books where I feel like I was going into it with this, I'm going to do this affirmative Deleuzian reading of it, but when you get into it, you're like, it already out affirmed me in advance, and like I am catching up to it, That was this is going to be like serial monologues. It's your turn, Diane.
Give us a monologue.
Oh, I don't have anything.
In relation to that, let's look at the pages that I was interested in there, and we'll wrap up in a few more minutes. But on 26 and 27, where he does or 24 through 27, where he does the reading of the cogito as a concept. Here's an example: the Cartesian cogito. Here's a concept, and we even have a diagram in there, which is great. Thinking, doubting, being, and I, and the various I's. Mm-hmm. And so we have this, like, okay, here's what it would mean for Deleuze to do a reading of a concept, a very well-known concept. Right. And then the part that interests me is the part that follows this, which is I take as, again, since I'm interested in what does it mean when I read and read other folks, here's the discourse on method, which is there's no point in wondering whether Descartes was right or wrong. Are implicit and subjective presuppositions more valid than explicit objective ones? Is it necessary to begin? And if so, is it necessary to start from the point of view, et cetera, et cetera? So, like, the question of correctness, mm-hmm. It's just not interesting. It just, whether or not Descartes is right, one can't, the way of assessing a concept is not that. It's not a question of correctness or adherence to a state of affairs. Is that how things really are? That's not. I mean, that's where, to me, we're beginning to develop a notion of rigor that is beyond correspondence or the usual ways that one thinks of what rigorous scholarship means, which is that, and they'll say, like, it has to be generative of other kinds of thinking, and that's a substantive definition of an alternative sense of rigor, I think. Mm-hmm. And why criticism is uninteresting?
I have a question to throw out there. I don't know, was this a question?
No, it's like, no, honestly, it's like one of the few chunks.
What the hell was that?
It's one of the few chunks that I felt like I actually had something to say about, so that's all.
That was good. Good. And maybe, no, I don't think I'm going to be able to blend this question.
You can do it.
So, I'm interested, maybe it is related, because it's clearly, as you were talking, you made me think about it. that there's a lot of, at least in communication, or no, I guess I would say at RSA, I experienced it as well, but at NCA certainly, of certain rhetorical scholars being really nervous or they don't see the value of a concept of immanence. Like, what is that really doing? I even read a critique on immanence, linking it to neoliberalism. Like, the smaller you get, you're just promoting a neoliberal approach. I guess my questions are: do you experience this? What do you think that Deleuze has a response that's productive? Do you where do you think that's coming from? What is so scary about immanence?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very familiar with that. The issue, for instance, Derrida won't have anything to do with the term immanence. I mean, has nothing nice to say about the term immanence. It's probably like the biggest conceptual difference between him and Deleuze is that he could never go down the road of thinking immanence, because immanence will tend to be equated with absolute immediacy and transparency, which is to say non-mediation, right? And non-mediation is a sort of originary, or in historical terms, fascist logic. And so it's the issue of immanence and immediacy plays very well. You have to do the work of immanence is only immanent to itself, right? You have to do that move in order for immanence to not seem like it is just. I'll say it this way: a covert way of smuggling in transcendence, right? Because the nice thing about transcendence is at least it claims transcendence, right? At least it's like, okay, I am dafür, right?
Yeah.
So, the problem with immanence is like, no, this is just leadership by the people, right? And this is all. So it's that you have no sense of a praxis of mediation when, you have no sense of differentiation when in fact there are pretty clear power dynamics.
So, that was very well said. I would agree. I think that it's partly, my take on it, Diane, is that when people hear immanence, similar to what John was saying, they hear homogeneity. They hear a loss of distinction. They hear no basis of judgment, right? Everything is the same. Right. And whenever you bring up like flat ontologies from posthumanism, people get freaked out. It's like, no, it's not flat meaning everything is the same. It just means that you give no preference to one thing always being superior or more important than to another, given a relation. There are times when my cat owns me, right? It does happen. And so that's a flat ontology. And the notion that you can have monism with infinite differences is Spinoza. That's why they keep coming back to Spinoza, saying he is the closest to getting this shit right. And I tend to agree. I think Spinoza, although problematic, is really brilliant around these sorts of issues. And that's what people don't, I think, understand about immanence. Immanence means that you are within, and everything happens within and folds back within. Right. Nothing ever separates. It's just one sort of like, if I cook a lot, so if like you're making a meringue and you're whipping up the eggs, you get a nice stiff meringue, you pull it out. It doesn't transcend. It's still part of that, even though it has a lot of form. It's one thing. The sense in which those forms lose distinction, I think, is a very bad understanding of immanence. And people hear monism and immanence and think humans dissolve into molecules. And like, of course we do, we are, but that's not all that we are. And so the immanence, like you were saying, John, is only immanent to itself. And a sense in which everything is just one is really only available for immanence. We don't experience immanence as oneness. We experience as one little corner of a gigantic expanse, and that's also Leibniz too. So like you enter into it from a particular point of view. So there's your desire for transcendence. The finite and the infinite coexist, and in fact the infinite depends on the finite. That's the really challenging sort of think piece. And Spinoza tries very hard to pull those things together. So the finite and the infinite are only thinkable together.
Or another axis in there is like, for instance, if instead of using the word immanence, we use the word unity or totality, you would totally understand exactly why people would have a problem with that. And I think that's what a lot of people hear a lot of times with immanence. But I would say it's like any other concept. Like, you can't just use the word ontology and think that you've moved past, sort of traditional notions of being as presence until you get to Heidegger. So, in Heidegger, beyond is a kind of ontology in quotation marks, or Derrida's hauntology, or locutions like that. So,
right.
Immanence as a concept doesn't buy you out of anything. It's like any other concept, like affect, which I think a lot of people think that affect just, we've solved, it's like, no, you're just talking about bodies now. You've not, but that's my personal pet peeve. But yeah, so you have to do work on any of these concepts in order to get them to reverberate differently. And it's a question, I always think it's a cost benefit. Like, some people, from some discursive orientations, the cost is way too high around unity and totality and sameness to even touch that, where there's just things that I can't touch either. So
my little footnote on that, I think, is the way, and I think this is where Jane Bennett is really great in the way she picks up Deleuze a little bit and brings vitality into it. And actually, the recent conference that both John and I were at, there was a lot of griping about vitalism in a very, I thought, unthoughtful way, and the sense in which the spark, the energy, the causative comes from somewhere. That's vitalism. And the sense in which things don't simply move on their own, some other thing, that's transcendence, trying to give immanence a purpose. To invert that and say the vitality is only available from within everything is a much harder position to take, and I think that's where it becomes problematic in terms of rhetoric. Rhetoric's model of thinking about action depends on one entity giving cause, giving spark, giving form, purpose, reason to another. And so I put vitality into something else. And if I can't do that, I don't know how to think about rhetoric particularly well. And I would just say, generally, that's a giant problem, going back to the notion of problematics, for rhetorical theories. How do you think the way in which things move or change without giving one entity the causative force that will then impart that force to something else? And it possesses it, as opposed to it flowing through it and being something that is welling up and coming from many places and simply moving through, as opposed to being given as a gift of sorts. That I find is very, very difficult. I don't know how to think about persuasion, for example, as anything other anymore than a specific version of vitalism. That this thing causes that other thing to be different. And so now its form has changed because of something is experienced. And that is a form of reproduction. It's just a form of reproduction that is modeled into communication theory or rhetorical theory. And monism makes it hard to hold on to that argument and that way of thinking, but we don't have any other model to look to. That's just a personal pet peeve of mine, in the sense that humans aren't gods anymore with the plane of immanence. And rhetoric really depends on humans becoming small gods in many, many ways, so that the great person can rise up, the one person can say or do or stand up and sort of have a superpower that is theirs and cause the world to be different. And if you can't have that anymore, the luster is gone, a lot of the great stories disappear, and that's something people don't want to give up on.
I don't think necessarily that the stories disappear, they change, and they don't have the same, we have to learn how to tell those stories and capture kairos in different places within those stories. There has to be different antagonists and protagonists. So, yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Well, so are there parting shots? I mean, I know you guys have been talking for a long time, and Nate's probably loaded at this stage.
I'm hammered.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely notice there's a sort of direct correlation between the number of drinks you have and the length of your responses. So, like, in another hour or so, it's just going to be total monologue. And I'm one to talk, I understand. Well, like, thanks. This to me is fun. I totally dug doing this, and we'll email and figure out if we continue on the concepts, percepts, affect, stuff so that I can gripe about affects. Although it did occur to me when you said that a moment ago, Nate, like it would be really cool to have a panel that's just pet peeves, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I have some.
okay, so what are some theory pet peeves?
Go for it, Diane.
Oh, my pet peeve is, I think, didn't I write this? Anytime someone uses turn, like that we're going through a turn, a post turn. But then also, anytime that we're talking about rhetorical criticism and we use object of study, which to me indicates some sort of Newtonian stability, or text, which gets you into. So those are my things that I would talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you about the turn one, though, because I would think, given the tropos orientation, you just have lots of turns.
Okay, so this is the issue with it. I'm working on a project, see if I can get this done. I'm analyzing the centennial issue of QJS, and I'm looking at the way that I'm finding, or I thought this was a hunch, and so I was looking to see what are the ways syntactically that people are describing, what are they putting, if we use object of study as a concept, what is being paired, what are the components of it? And what I find is these very Newtonian themes that are attached with it. So you have object, you have things that are under, over, there's a center there. So and then it's paired with Euclidean geometry as well. So we have these tropes of Newtonian physics embedded within the way that we are talking about object of study. And that is interesting. Then you think about the field turning, because if you have this, Newtonian notion, then the field is doing this, even though we all know it's a lot more complicated than that. The interesting part is when you follow the citations, when people indicate that a turn is happening, where are those citations taking you? And it's more like black holes. They go to crazy places. These are not distinct turns. These are taking you through a time warp. I like, Nate's notion of recursivity. There's a tropological, what is the term? I can't think of it. But in any case, so there's more of like a quantum mechanics of what is actually taking place when we talk about turns, rather than this Newtonian sense of.
Okay, so let me ask you: would you be willing to accept the notion of the turn if it didn't involve movement forward, which is to say, it was just turning? there was no line, right? There's no line going. It's just.
But it's the same. I guess it's still, the line is implied. I would need to know how it was being deployed.
I don't have a problem with lines, though. Lines are fine, but I think the stability part is what upsets me too. I agree with that. And I've often felt, and so you've been paying closer attention to this, people, when people talk about objects, they resort to cutting metaphors, like you're chiseling. And when they talk about tropes, they resort to fluid dynamic metaphors. They'll use things that are literally fluids much more frequently as metaphors than when they talk about objects, because then it's like chiseling things away. So there's this sense in which these metaphors just cohere, and sort of you're drug into a kind of metaphoric universe when you go one direction versus the other. And and going back to the plane of immanence, if there's a sense in which there's an immanence where rhetoric is an object that is then worked, as opposed to rhetoric being an instability or a movement. And I think both of those things are really present in the tradition. And we talk out of both of those.
I just, if I knew what my object of study was, I don't think I'd have the courage to study it. Like, I mean, I just really feel as if the question of the object of study, I mean, what is my object of study? Like the invention book, what was the object of study? I mean, I don't know. I have no idea.
New stuff.
Right, I mean.
Diane disappeared. Where'd you go?
Lost Diane.
No. Shit.
But you guys do use the terminology of object of study a lot, huh? I'm going to invite her to.
Some do.
Oh, now she's back. Now she's back without video.
Well, that's interesting. This is my last parting shot, I guess, is I'm really methodologically oriented. I like to have processes and steps that I use, and I follow them pretty closely, even if I don't write about them when I do my work.
Yeah.
And it helps me think. And so the object of study for me is not so much an object as it is a feeling of where I want to go. And so it is a movement, but it doesn't have a destination. Like I don't think I'm going to actually get somewhere. I just want to keep walking in that direction somehow.
Right, but that's a direction or an orientation. I mean, that's in fact
orientation. Yeah.
That the whole point, like what I'm doing on this style book, is entirely about style as orientation or inclination, or so yeah. But that's really very different than an object of study in any sense of the term object.
Yeah,
you know, it's like a compulsion. You're drawn. We keep losing Diane.
Gone again. Shit.
Let's see.
He's rebooting. So I have a question for you on the style part, though. So when you look at style as orientation, I think of memory as orientation. I think of style more as selectivity or parsing out.
Hold on. She's texting me. Hold on, because I want to hear this. Okay, say it again. Say again.
Okay, so when I think of orientation, I think of memory work. I think of emplacement. I think of having a present, a place that you can stand. That's orientational. Style to me seems to be selectivity, parsing out, the cutting room floor, so to speak. Things are separated out, and there's certain things are continued and certain things are not. And I don't necessarily think of it as orientation, although the modality aspect of style, it does have a kind of posture to it. It's got a way of, you know, a jauntiness to a style that's distinctive. So why would you think of it as orientation?
Well, honestly, I'm getting something.
Did Diane call him?
I think so.
Where are you, Diane?
Oh, hold on. Poor Diane. Diane and Keeling. Diane and Keeling. Am I spelling that right? Keeling at Gmail. Okay. This is good because I totally want your feedback.
Invited back to the call. Can you invite her back?
Yeah, I just did.
Okay.
No, she cannot come back in.
No, because I'm working on style as well right now for a different reason and a different project, and so I'm curious about the orientational aspect of it. Because I find style very difficult. Invention, I think, is really hard. Your book was great, but I think it's very hard to think about. And the one that I'm finding the most difficult is actually delivery, without just folding it into being performativity. Anything else about delivery other than performativity, what would it be? I find that very hard to think about.
Okay, so video call.
I don't use this very often.
Okay, she's trying to call me on another call.
How do you add into this one?
Can you try inviting her?
Let me try. Nope, that didn't work.
Needless to say, all of this is going to make it into the final cut.
Yeah, because this is awesome. This is the best part right now.
I mean, who doesn't want to see this?
Basic technologies. It's awesome. Yes, 3 PhDs, 1 Google chat. So many things can go wrong. Where is it?
Did you send her an invite?
I don't know how to do it.
Oh, okay. I'll send again. I just sent it to her Gmail account. You're texting on your computer?
Yep.
Well, that's pretty cool, man.
But so, like, style to me is also like, I like to think of the the canons as powers, specific powers that arise or possible. They change, and so invention is a power to create, or arrangement's a power to create order or to order. Memory is a power to recall or forget. Style, I can't put into that kind of phrase. So it's confusing my neat little system that I had lined up, which of course means I'm fucked. But
my claim, here's my claim.
What?
My claim is that style is a synecdoche for rhetoric. All of rhetoric is style. And that's because style, well, I have several levels of the claim. So it actually sort of starts from a theory posture, which is that despite all it's been written about Derrida, Deleuze, and the whole Nietzsche, what I'm calling the Nietzschean lineage, that we haven't paid attention to style. Like what they have to teach us is much more, or could have had to teach us, is a how of engagement, a how of relationality, a how of response. So, I mean, Derrida's the closest one to this in terms of an ethical discourse, but that, we could think in terms of the how of, what I mean by style in that sense is in the first book, I use the term style of engagement, and that's what I'm talking about, like the how of orienting towards whatever one is thinking or writing about, and that nobody really talked about it. We talked about the lessons, the concepts, the propositions of things, but we didn't talk about the how. And I think that those thinkers are heavily, and Nietzsche in particular, is totally, like the whole thing is a how. It's saying I can't join. Let's try it again.
Well, see, that's the power part of it. That's the capacitating part. It's a capacity to that I find it is really, really interesting. But for me, it also comes back to a triangle of the beautiful, the sublime, and the grotesque, of both having closure, experiencing limits, and then also the disruption of closure, where it's not closed anymore, and that becomes very unsettling. And so those orientations, as you describe them to me, have certain basic features to them, and so that something becomes defined and closed, it opens up, or in the very enclosure, it shows you more than it could possibly hope to. And that's the kind of the aesthetic experience of style, to me, is really important. If I have an orientation towards the world and I start to inhabit it in a certain way, I'm often seeking a certain, closure, putting a pen around things to some extent. But that will inevitably also run me up against that which I cannot understand, and it will also get disrupted in certain ways. So it will become grotesque, it will become sublime. And that part I find really fascinating. Like,
well, I have a different
be in that style.
So, I mean, all of us are variously open and closed to various kinds of things. And, so there's some things that are permeable to me and some things I just can't hear. There are some things that if I heard them would wreck my life, and there's some things that would be inconsequential and are inconsequential. And so I guess another way of talking about orientation is like permeability. And by permeability, I don't mean a quantitative, I mean what types of things. And that's where the second element of the claim for me is that styles of pedagogy, which is that all we are doing is walking around in the world teaching orientations. And not just us, everything, right? Like what all things are is pedagogical styles. That's what they are. So it's an ontological claim that things are. So that's why I say rhetoric is style. And by the way, style is an ontological pedagogy. So
interesting.
So that's the move. Diane keeps trying to get on and she can't.
She's a goer. She doesn't give up. But for me, the place I'm coming to it is I always like to take.
Oh, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna call her and speakerphone her in.
There you go. I always like to. I work through specific historical critical projects, and so for me, I'm interested in fetal presencing. Imaging the existence of fetal life now for us.
We got her on FaceTime.
There we go. Woo! That's awesome.
21st century. We can figure it out somehow, Diane. Yeah.
And
unfortunately, you have to share the screen with me. Unfortunately.
Yeah. For for me, the style question, the aesthetic question, and those aren't the same thing, but they merge, is around how the presence of fetal life, the way in which it's made present to us, and we bump into it now in all kinds of ways, has a kind of stylistic affordance to us, a style in which we can engage in being and politics that we didn't have before. And so for me, it is orientational in the way that you're just saying. I think it is, but for me, it also provides a kind of selectivity. Certain things are removed, certain things are excised, because styling, going from like the stilo, it involves a certain sort of cutting and
Derrida's book on style is right exactly, or Derrida on Nietzsche is a book on style, which is the stilos and the cutting, the rapier.
Right.
So yeah, the selection makes sense to me. I just, at least for me, that's not the angle. I mean, one of the things that I want to do is first of all, just get away from style and content, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, that rather, and obviously this is important for rhetorical purposes, is that, you know, style is usually seen as this sort of, or traditionally seen as that sort of epiphenomena added onto content, right? Content comes first, and then one puts the style on it, or one adds rhetoric to it, and one gets, you know, the final product. For me, when I think of style as orientation or comportment, Stimmung in Heidegger, you know, when I think of it in those terms, style is the condition of possibility for any given content. Right, like one's orientation towards the world or towards an interaction, or is the thing that's going to produce what will have been called content. So that's the sense in which style as orientation, styles of engagement, is quote unquote primary, and primary, pedagogical, and ontological. That's not the title of the book. I don't know what the fucking title is.
Yeah, that's not a good title. Don't do that one. That needs a better one.
Diane, we got totally sucked into a conversation about style while we were. Was this someone's pet peeve that I missed? No, this is a project that I'm working on right now, and Nate's also doing some stuff on style. So we just got into, like, you know, he's style in terms of cutting and differential exposures, and then my style as comportment or orientation. So. Right. Yeah, we're just talking about.
We're not alien to each other. They're different points of entry into style as like this really wild and interesting idea. And I agree. The sense in which style gets kicked out to the extra that's added on later is a very offensive way that gets talked about in rhetoric. It's very bad.
Yes.
But for me, the way, I guess the counter argument I would say, sort of going the other direction, is that for me, all of those different canonical issues are requisite of each other. Like, style does not make sense without memory, because it has to be recreated. The style is creative in a sense, so it needs inventive, but there's also a style of invention. There are styles of memory. There are styles, so each one needs the other in different ways. And to me, the sense that one is primary is challenging. I would just say I think that.
Yeah, but see,
I have a favorite. I like them all, I guess.
What I'm doing, Nate, is I'm trying to get Diane right. What I'm doing is, you see, I'm going to go through the whole canon, and it's going to be the future of series, in which I claim that each one is primary in each successive book, right? So I did invention first, styles next, and then I'll worry about arrangement. That's going to be my materiality book, right? I mean, so.
This is so funny. You're like doing my project in a completely different way, or I'm doing your project in a completely different way. That's so much fun. I love it. That's great. Yeah, they're all primary. They're all the best. You're my favorite child.
Can I push on something you said earlier? I know we're done, and you guys have been way too patient with me. So right now, at any point, you can just say, "Shut the hell up, John. I gotta go." Sure. But when you were talking previously about the tension between novelty, innovation, and sort of sheer repetition, okay. I have an aversion to that version, because that is the definition of dialectics, right? That what produces is a tension between, there's the desire for the new and there's the desire for the old, and it's precisely the tension between the two that inhabits this kind of middle ground space, is where actual stuff happens, which is to say, oppositions are generative of some sort of, some sort of novelty. And so, are you really a Hegelian, Nate?
No, I'm not.
Which would be okay.
don't see those as dialectical. I don't. I see them as immanent. Haha. No,
How can they be in tension then?
Well, no, the tension exists not in their opposition, but in the fact that both need each other in the same way that two people who love each other need each other, right? There's a tension there, but it's not an opposition. It's not like a binary in any way. So that what is new and what is familiar are really very, very similar sorts of things. And for me, that's Heraclitean. It's not dialectical.
Why does the familiar need the new?
Well, there wouldn't be a new without it. And the same way there wouldn't be a familiar without a new. So they both are requisite to each other, but they're not actually in opposition.
Isn't this just difference in repetition? I mean, that with each repetition there is a newness that emerges, that they depend on each other?
So okay.
No. Yeah. I think they are related, but I think I'm really talking about the sense in which something is unfamiliar and familiar can coexist, and in fact they do coexist all the time, and that's not actually a dialectic. So the uncanny sometimes is a way of getting at this, but nothing is completely redundant and nothing is completely new. There's always some mixture of those experiences. And I mean, I grant you, there are certain things which are so completely familiar that there is nothing new to them. Things can become completely banal in that way. And there are those moments when things are wholly different, you've never seen it before, you're sort of shocked into a kind of experience. I think those do exist, but they're so rare. Most of what happens is some weird composite of, which is a tension, that you feel a tension, but I wouldn't call it a dialectic. I really don't think they turn on each other as an opposition that's sort of pushing the other in some direction. I just think that the life experienced is something that is both, oh yeah, I've seen that before, and what the fuck is that? It's like constantly both at the same time. Like you holding up a phone on a Google chat.
My arm's getting tired.
Yet totally weird in my experience.
Well, hold on, because I have, this is one for me that I find to be a very interesting contemporary theoretical question. And it's this, it's that most understandings of the relation between difference and repetition sound, so my chair is suddenly sliding down. I'm falling out of the picture. Is that there is repetition, things repeat, and then they change because, for instance, the context changes or something about them changes. So with any given repetition, difference is necessarily introduced, right? Mm-hmm. But in that understanding, difference is an external phenomena that's a product of repetition having to happen in time and space. So it's not an internal quality of repetition itself. And it seems to me that the thinkers who are, an interesting thing, the thinkers who are most invested in futurity, and here I mean Nietzsche, Derrida particularly, are the thinkers who are, and Deleuze, who are most committed to repetition, and not repetition as repetition with a difference. But like in Nietzsche, the eternal return, I mean, that is repetition as repetition can get, right? Mm-hmm. And indifference in repetition, right? That the sense of repetition there is, they're interested in the most banal mechanical repetition, and that is because repetition never begins from a point of self-unity and always begins from a point of what something is self-differentiating. Right. Sheer, absolute mechanical, the most mechanical repetition you can get is itself differential, not because an external difference comes into play, but because of the internal self-differentiation of difference, which is to me why the understanding of repetition as different as repetition with a difference, which is like, okay, we used to say the word queer in one resonance, and then it was appropriated and taken up somewhere else and applied in a different context, it has a different resonance, is not at all what those thinkers are after, because that's social contextual becomes the terrain of difference, whereas repetition itself is just the terrain of sameness.
Well, see, for me, that was my idea about recursion, is exactly that, is the sense in which the difference is embedded within for me, the forgetting is involved in the remembering. They need each other, they happen at the same time, and whatever is going on is a function of both simultaneously. It's not one against the other, one doesn't eat the other, one doesn't undo the other, they both make each other happen. And so that is, for me, yeah, it's completely immanent. And out of that sense of well, newness and familiarity, but the composite of that for me is where you get a sense of place that allows addressivity to occur. So to shift away from just the mechanics of difference and repetition or recursion or difference, those dynamisms for me are what say, I am here now leaning this way or that way. And that is what memory does for me in terms of rhetoric. It allows the recursion of these different dynamics, allow us to have some sort of gravel underneath our feet when we are beginning to move this way or that way, and it's completely temporary. And so it's not something that's the tension is not so much one of two things opposing each other, but the tension of being poised and ready to do this or do that. It's kind of an anxiety, I guess, that exists within them. And so, yeah, I would agree with that. I don't like the idea, though, of focusing so much on difference and repetition, or even novel and familiar, even though I brought it up, because I think the unity of those things happening with each other is really where the ball game is on that concept. And we don't have words to make those things operate at the same time. That's why I tried to coin a term for it. It doesn't really work at all. It's an ugly word. But I think that the sense in which having one word that can accommodate what those things do at the same time would be nice. But we don't have one of those. We have to say difference and repetition. Say what?
Difference.
Well, yeah, difference, yeah.
Or I think for me, the word that's better at it is iteration.
Yeah.
I mean, itar from the Sanskrit for the other, right? So, I mean, or at least that's, you know, the etymology that Derrida uses in signature event context conveniently.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Diane, you're wearing my arm out. Oh, I got a text.
This is awesome.
I got a tweet.
We have tweets and everything. This is really a new.
You're so fucking multimedia, man.
Cool.
Well,
I do actually have to sign off.
Yes, no doubt. And thanks, guy. I totally dig this, and thanks so much for the time, energy, and enthusiasm. And I mean, I'll do some cutting of it, and mostly just get Nate out of the entire interaction. But seriously, thanks again. And I'm definitely gonna be in touch very soon because we need to talk about symbiogenesis and we need to talk about style. So there's many more miles to go before we sleep. So
cool.
Thank you for organizing, John. This is wonderful.
Absolutely. This is a lot of fun. This is great.
But I got to not call it a conversation. I got to figure out another word for it because it sounds too much like communication, and this is a bad thing.
Serial diatribes. A bunch of serial diatribes. That's what it was.
Okay, diatribes. That's for pet peeves.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I'll talk to you both soon.
Cool. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.